Cars Garage. I'm excited about this video. I've been planning it for some time and all the parts are finally in. And what we're going to do is we're going to build the transmission for the two-wheel drive Slash. And I believe this is a good budget way to build your transmission instead of buying the new Traxxas 272R transmission or the Proline transmission, which costs over $100. This is using hot racing parts. It's going to use the hardened steel idler gear, the sealed aluminum differential, the carbon fiber slipper clutch pads, and an aluminum case for the transmission itself. So when I got the Slash, I noticed that there's a lot of play in the transmission itself. The idler gear was stripped and the top shaft would always move around. So every time I've only ran it a handful of times, and every time I'd run it, it would strip a spur gear. So I decided, since the plastic transmission case has a lot of flex in it, I wanted to get away from that and get the aluminum transmission case, and hopefully stiffen that up and prevent, the shafts from moving around and stripping spur gears. So follow along and I'll show you how to take apart your transmission, and I'll show you how to transfer everything over to another transmission case, whether it's aluminum or plastic. But let's get started. So first, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to remove the rear end assembly off the chassis. And in order to do that, we're going to disconnect the motor from the ESC. So we'll have to take this off to get a little bit better access. And then we're going to remove two screws that are located here and here. And then on the bottom, we're going to remove the 6 screws that hold on the rear end to the chassis. Alright, with all those screws out and the motor disconnected, all you gotta do is lift up and then pull back. Now you can set the chassis aside since we won't need it. Alright, so next what we're gonna wanna do is remove the motor, and that's gonna be these 2 screws here. Next, we're going to remove the rear bumper, and in order to do that, we have to remove this screw here and these 2 screws here. And put the screws back where they came out of, so it'll be easier to reinstall, just like that. You can set that aside. So next, what we want to do is we want to remove the shock tower, the axles, and the control arms from the transmission case itself, so we can have access to the transmission. So in order to do that, we'll start off with removing the axle and the control arms. Depending on which model you have, you may have a Phillips or a Hex. Next, you want to remove the axle, and there's a screw here. Be careful not to lose this because they're very small, hard to find. Now you can just pull the axles off, just like so. And now, to get better access to the screws that hold the shock tower on, they're located here. In order to get better access to those, I'd recommend taking off the body mounts. And the body mounts is going to be 4 screws here. And we won't need this for a while, so you can set that aside. Now you have access to the 2 screws here and here that hold the shock tower onto the transmission. All right, now the transmission can come right off, and you can set this aside for later. So next what we want to do is take the spur gear off. And in order to do that, we take off this nut. When you try to take this nut off, it might spin the outdrives here and here. So just hold the outdrives and you should be able to take it off. Take note of how everything came off. Mine had the nut, the spring, and then it had a washer. And now you can take the spur gear off. I'll be replacing the spur gear, so when we get to that point, I'll take note. I can take off this piece here. I have a new one, so I'll be replacing it, so that way the material from the slipper pad clutch from the stock one and the new carbon pads that I have won't interfere with the grip. So I'll be replacing this. Additionally, you could take some sandpaper and rough this up, rough it and smooth it out a little bit to kind of clean off any material. So when you get to this point, there's a pin. So make sure you don't lose this pin. And now we can take the transmission case apart and get to the internals. So on the motor side, the motor installs on this side, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws holding the case together. So we can take those out. All right, with all the screws out, all you have to do is separate the 2 halves, just like that. Now, I know all my bearings are good because in my previous video, I replaced them all. So I'll just take everything out of the transmission case. And kind of place everything together as it came out. And I know that there's some bearings still stuck in there. So all I'm gonna do is take one of my drivers and just push the bearing out, just like that. And same on this side. And then you can take a pick and slowly work your way around to get the bearing for the top shaft out. Now we no longer need this, so we can set that aside. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to prepare all the new parts to put into the new transmission. So the first thing I'm going to do is prepare the idler gear. So here's the new idler gear. Very nice quality. Beautiful machining. So what we're going to do is we're going to take off the shaft from the old idler gear, and then we're going to remove the bearings from the old idler gear just by pushing the bearings out just like that. And we're going to reinstall the bearings. All you got to do is just push them in just like that, and reinstall the idler gear shaft just by pushing it through. Now on the Traxxas diagram, it shows that there's a shim on each side. So I'm going to install a shim on both sides. All right, these shims are very important. I like to keep some extras in my bag just in case you need some extras. Okay. So the idler gear has the bearings on, has the shim, so we can set that aside. And the stock idler gear, see if I can show you in the video. You can see it's missing teeth. So definitely want to upgrade this, cheap upgrade. Great, be good for reliability. So I'm gonna set these bearings aside for now, because what we're gonna do, and the top shaft, because what we're gonna do next is we're going to open up the differential and install the internals into the aluminum differential case. So let's go ahead and open this. The machining quality is pretty good. There's some nicks on the edges. So it's not as great as I would have hoped. There are some nicks which causes this face to kind of not be completely flat. Additionally, there's no instructions, but overall, pretty nice piece and upgrade. So it comes with these 3 pieces along with 4 screws, some seals, and it looks like 1 small washer. Let's go ahead and open up this differential, and mine looks like it's got 2 different types of fasteners, so take note of that when you open yours up. Depending on if you bought yours new or used, it might have different fasteners. So the stock Traxxas differential is not sealed, and it only comes with grease, and that grease can leak out. And if you want to tune it for different track conditions, you really can't, because it's not sealed. So whatever fluid you put in there, it'll leak out. So in order for me to get it out, I just pushed on the out drive and it just came apart. so doesn't look like anything is broken. At least it still has some grease in there, but looks pretty old. Nothing looks broken, everything looks like it's in pretty good condition. Right, so in the differential, there's 4 pins, and you have to remove those and reinstall it in the new housing. And all I did was take some pliers and just grab on, and you can just pull them out. It's pretty easy. So take those out. I'm gonna take these out and then go clean all these metal parts and internals with brake cleaner, and I'll be right back. All right, so I sprayed everything down with carb cleaner or brake cleaner and got all the grease off that I could. And now I'm just gonna kind of wipe it down with one of these shop towels and get any grease that might still be kind of hard to get, but the brake cleaner got it all for the most part. You know, and after inspection, everything looks fine. No teeth are missing, chipped, or anything like that. So we can definitely reuse this. So what I want to do next is I want to polish up these pins, since the little spider gears rotate on them. I want to make sure that they're nice and smooth and they don't have any rough spots that might prevent them from rotating freely. So what I like to do here is I'll take my drill and I'll take some Never Dull. So I want to polish these pins, and what I do is I'll take a drill and put the pin in the drill. You don't have to check up too hard. Just check up the end that is going to be installed in the diff, just ever so slightly, and use the Never Dull to polish it up. All right, so definitely much smoother and cleaner than before. You can definitely feel it by hand. And I want to do the same thing to the out drives, because they're gonna sit in here and they're gonna have an O-ring behind it. So you want to make sure that it's nice and smooth, and make sure that there's no nicks or anything like that in the metal that might cut the O-ring. Just gonna just lightly chuck it into the drill. You have to be careful on this one, since you're gonna have to be between the gear and the chuck itself. Clean it up a little bit. Let's do the other side. So that one is nice and clean now. So take note of your pins, because some of them have, you'll see that one side is kind of short and one is long in terms of wear and cleanliness. So you can see here, this is kind of long on this side and this is short. So take note of that as how they go in. So the long side will go in this hole and this hole, and the short sides will go in that hole and this side over here. You can open up the seals. these O-rings will attach onto the out drives like so. The little included shim looks like it's going to go on this piece here. So let's install it. This piece with the shim and O-ring. And what I want to do is add a little bit of grease, or I'm going to add some silicone fluid to the O-ring. Alright, so I decided to use 100K diff fluid in the rear. So just going to add a little bit of that fluid onto that O-ring. Okay. Next, we're going to install the idler gears, or the spider gears, I mean. So when I turn this out drive, you see they're all turning. That's what we want. For these next few steps, I'm going to use my buggy stand that I designed and use one of the shock holes to kind of hold it in place. We're going to go ahead and get the O-rings, the larger O-rings that came with the kit. There's 2 of them. They're very small, so be careful. You probably want to lube these up as well. Put a little bit of silicone fluid on there and just lube these up. And they're going to install in the groove that's in the gear. So take note of that and be very patient in installing this O-ring, because it only came with 2. You need 2, and if you mess this up, your differential will leak. So slowly put it into the groove and it'll stay in place. Now I can do the other side. Be patient and slowly work that O-ring into the groove. It's not too difficult, just tedious. So it's installed on both sides. It's sitting where it's supposed to. And all you have to do is line up the holes. I'm gonna add some silicone fluid. We're gonna add some silicone fluid on the groove here. I'm actually gonna try to put quite a bit, so that way when I install this out drive, that silicone fluid will hopefully hold it in place, so when you turn it over, it doesn't fall out. All right, so now what we can do is fill up the diff, and from my understanding, most Traxxas diffs like to be filled about halfway, so just be patient. The 100K diff fluid is pretty thick. I'm gonna carefully rotate the gear and try to work some of that fluid down to the bottom. Okay, I worked that diff fluid down in there. It's about half full. So we can now install the top. Take note that these bosses here and here will install here and here on the sides where the pin is the longest. You might need to adjust or wiggle the out drive to get it in the position. All the holes are lining up. And now we can install the included screws. And since these screws are going in the metal, I'm gonna add just a tiny drop of thread locker on each screw. And remember, if you do this, that when you take it apart, you want to heat up that screw with a soldering iron, so that way when you take it apart, it doesn't strip the screw head. And you want to tighten this in a crisscross pattern. So we'll do this side first. Get it about halfway down, then move on to this side. And then over here. And then this one. We're going to get this one shouldered up ever so slightly, and then go back over here. Shouldered up. Shouldered up. Shouldered up, and now we're going to go back and finally tighten it down. And not going to go too tight. You just kind of go back and forth and try to tighten it evenly until all of them are tight. Okay, and there we go. The diff is built, and now it's ready to install. And definitely feels much nicer than the old diff. You actually have some fluid in there, and now you can tune it to the track conditions. So now that all the internals are prepped and ready to go, we can start prepping the aluminum transmission case. We need to take the transmission case apart, and there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws holding it together. Alright, so just notice that this one screw is short and all of them are long. So I'm going to leave that one in there for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take all these heat sinks off and put a little bit of blue Loctite on it so it doesn't come off. So you can buy the Hot Racing one, or you can try out some of the Amazon ones. They're the same design, the quality might be a little different, but you could save a few bucks here and there. As long as you know what you're doing, you know, you could probably, if the tolerances are a bit loose, you can shim it up and make it work. Don't plan to remove any of these little heat sinks, so a decent amount of Loctite should work. So next, the kit comes with these. You have a right side and a left side, and these are where the hinge pins go. So you need to install these with the provided screws. Okay, so it's going to be these 4 screws here. And you have the left and right side, so you can put your 2 halves together, and you know that this is the front of the car. So this is the right side, and it's going to install with this facing down. So take the 2 halves apart, take 2 screws, and put a good amount of Loctite on those. You don't want these to back out. Kind of a bad design in my opinion, because if these back out and are in the transmission case, it can ruin your gears. So definitely don't be shy when putting Loctite on those. And tighten it down pretty good. It's going into metal, so you can kind of crank down on it a little bit, but not too hard, because you don't want to strip it out. Okay. Now we can do the other side. Or the flat side will go towards the bottom, and the lettering is going to be on top. So just like that. I'm going to add some Loctite, a good amount. Okay. Those are tightened down. Now we can assemble the transmission together. So first we're going to install the bearings. Right. So we got bearings installed for the differential and the top shaft. The idler gear has the bearings already installed with its shims, so we'll put that in first. Make sure your shims are installed onto your top shaft. There's going to be one on each side. And then when you install your differential, this is the left side. Make sure you install this facing down. There's only one way to install it, because if you install it the other way, you'll notice that the gear won't engage. So I'll kind of show you like that, the gear doesn't engage. So there's only one way. And now we can install this other half. It might be easier to put the bearings on the shafts themselves, because they may want to fall out. Kind of put it together. I mean, the top shaft doesn't wiggle around at all. If it does, you can add another shim and kind of tighten that up, but everything moves nice and smooth, so we can go ahead and install the screws. So remember, this one short screw goes here. So I'm going to add just a little bit of Loctite, because I do not want this to come apart due to vibration and such. So with that one on, we can install the motor plate, just like so. There's a little boss here on the transmission that lines up with the motor plate. Makes it easy to line up, just like so. Everything is still moving nice and free. And we're gonna add just a little bit of Loctite on all these screws, and then just kind of dab any excess off on the paper towels. Right. Everything is still moving nice and free. There's no movement in the top shaft at all. That's exactly what you want. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add some grease to the teeth and make sure that I can basically get grease on all these gears. So I have some Ultimate Racing gearbox Teflon grease that I use. It's served me well. I use it on all my vehicles. It's nice and tacky. It stays on the gears. You don't need a lot. If you put too much in it, it's just gonna spray it around everywhere. But this stuff is nice because it's tacky and it doesn't get off the gears that easily. It'll stay on and keep a nice and light coat on it. So just gonna put it on. As you can see, it's nicely coated all the gears, and it'll make its way on the idler and on the top shaft, and the action is still nice and smooth. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and wipe off any excess on the bottom. Alright, I got some rubbing alcohol on my paper towel, and I'm just going to go around the edges and clean off any oil residue, or I mean grease residue, and let that dry. And then what I'm going to do is while that's drying, I'm going to grab a piece of tape. You can use electrical tape. I've got some Gorilla tape. I'm just going to stick a piece on there. I run in pretty clean conditions, but if you're running in dirty conditions, you don't want anything getting in there. So a small piece of tape to cover that up will help that. So small piece of tape. Cover that up, just like so. And that'll prevent any dirt from getting in there. So transmission is assembled, all the new parts are in there, it's sealed. We've got new screws to use when we install this onto the chassis. We've got some hardware that came with the kit that is going to be used to install the rear bumper. It can be confusing, but we'll figure it out. Next, what we can do is we can prepare the new slipper clutch assembly. So we're no longer going to use these slipper pads, but we want to use the holder, and we need to reuse this bearing. So you can just use a tool to pop out that bearing. I'm going to take off these 3 screws that hold that slipper pad assembly onto the spur gear. You can take a tool and just push out the pad holder, just like so. I'm going to use a 83 tooth spur gear. I find the car already too fast to be on carpet, with the way it is, so this should hopefully slow it down a little bit. You can just stick your fingernails underneath the pads and remove them, just like so. Another good way to get them out is actually just thread in the screws that came off, and that'll actually just push them out. You can see I just pushed it out, nice and easy. Alright, with those kind of pushed out a bit, you can just use a flathead to just pry the rest of it off. You can set those aside. So now we'll install the Hot Racing carbon fiber pads. These actually came as a spare when I bought the car, so why not put these on and try them out. Alright, all you gotta do is just push them on and they're good. And now you just line up the holes in the spur gear. Just push them on and then install your screws. Okay, so just actually on this piece, it's just a little steel pad that's on there, so you can just pop that off. And I've got this, it's 5552X. It came with the car when I bought it, so we'll go ahead and just install this new friction plate that's in here. And to install it, all you gotta do is line it up with the 4 bosses, just push down and it will kind of hold it in place. Additionally, you could probably put some CA glue or something. Since it came with a new pin, we'll install it with the new pin. Take note of the orientation. I've got the new friction disc on there. You've got the new pads on there. And we can install the bearing like such and install that onto the shaft. Next, we're going to reuse the washer. And since the kit came with a new spring, we'll use that. And the new nut. There's another spring and another nut that's larger. That is meant for the slash 4x4, so we're not going to use that. So these out drives are moving, so you can put an Allen, a small Allen in there to prevent it from moving around. Just like so, and then you can just go ahead and tighten it down. I'm just going to tighten it until the lock nut is on the metal. The nylon part is on the metal, and I'm going to leave it there until I get it in the car and I can actually tune that slipper clutch. So what we're going to do is we want to install the rear bumper onto the transmission. That'll kind of give us a better idea of how it's going to install. And as you can see here, there's space here and here where it's going to install. So these pieces that came with the kit, we're going to use that to space out what we need, along with the new screws that came with it. So hopefully these are the screws that we're going to need, and we have a nut as well. So we'll see how all this is going to install. So it looks like on the bottom, use one of the small provided screws to hold this piece in place, and then you can install the included box head screw like such. And then on the top, it looks like you need to use the long screw on this side, along with the spacer and then this metal piece. And this piece is not drilled out big enough to get this through. But for now, we'll go ahead and install the bottom piece here. So what I'll do is I'm going to put some Loctite on this small screw. So one of these is threaded and the other one is not. One of them just has a through hole. So for this piece here, it's supposed to be this long screw that's included and the nut. But right now, as you can see, that the hole is not big enough to get that screw through it. So I'll take this to the garage and drill it out. But before I do that, I'm gonna go ahead and install this lower piece. And let me go drill this out and I'll be right back. All right, so I drilled it out. Not perfect, but it's larger and the bolt does go through. So now we can install the included screw on the bottom. We're going to add a little bit of Loctite on it so it doesn't back out. You don't need to tighten down on it too hard. So that's installed. Now what we're going to do is we're going to install this long screw. And how to install this is you're going to stick it in on this side. You're going to install the aluminum spacer, and then you'll move it up because that spacer goes in between the bumper and the motor plate itself. So once you have that installed, see if you can get a better view. Just like that, you're going to install the larger aluminum spacer. It is a tight fit, so just be patient. Yeah, so got it through, and now what we can do is put on the lock nut that was included in the kit. So that's installed. So the transmission and rear bumper assembly is together. So what we'll do first is we're going to reinstall our suspension first, and then we'll install it onto the chassis. So the hinge pin fit is extremely tight. And it looks like I'm actually using the screwdriver to push in the pin, otherwise it's pretty much impossible to do by hand. And it's so tight that the suspension doesn't even want to move, but I think just running it a little bit might help loosen it up, but it is pretty tight, so I don't know how this will end up working. This side seems to be going in a little easier, but it still seems like the suspension is going to be stiff on this side. Yeah, and it doesn't move freely. A little bit easier than the other side, but we'll see. Go ahead and reinstall the axles. Take note when you're installing the axles because there's flats, and one side is actually going to have the hole for your pin, and the other side probably doesn't have any threads on there yet, so make it easier to know which side that is when you install your pins. Make sure your holes are lining up and reinstall your pin. And remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to tighten down on it too hard. Once you feel it shoulder up, it's good. Now we can do the other side. Now we can install the rear tower onto the transmission. You can add some Loctite on here if you want. I'm not going to, since the length of my Allen is pretty long here, and I'm just afraid that if I Loctite it, it might be difficult to get out and possibly strip out that head. So I'm just going to leave it like this and just keep an eye on it every time I drive to make sure those screws aren't backing out. And the suspension moves. Not too happy about how stiff the pins are, but hopefully in time it'll loosen up, and I'll report back if it does. But now that the rear tower is on, we can install the body mounts. So now the rear assembly is put together, we can install this onto the chassis. Alright, so now we can install the rear end onto the chassis, and the best way to do that is to flip the chassis over. And what you're going to do is you're going to slide the chassis into the rear bumper right here and make sure that it slides into place, and there it is. That's how it's going to sit. Now we can install the big screws that came with the kit. You can install Loctite on these if you want. I'm not going to right now. I want to see how everything works out before I do that. And since I'll be running on carpet, I'm going to stick a chassis protector on here to make sure that these screws don't back out and rip the carpet. And I just reused the screws that came off the old chassis. Now flip it over and we can install the two screws here and here. Remember, you're going into plastic here, so you don't need to tighten down too hard. All right, now finally we can install the motor. and depending on the pinion size that you have, may or may not be able to get it through, and looks like I'm able to get mine through. So I'm going to go ahead and feed my motor wires through here. So now I'm going to set my mesh, and the way I like to set my mesh is basically get it together as tight as I can, and then I'll move the motor out. So that way I want to be able to move the pinion just a little bit before it touches the spur gear. And when you do this, you should be able to hear it like rock back and forth. And that's where I like it. And that's where I like it right there. Just double check, I'm tightening down. Yep, exactly how I like it. Now you can finish up by plugging your motor in. And with the Traxxas, it makes it easy. And the colors are, or all the wires are color coded. And then you can just tuck the wires down here. And then you can reinstall this wire retainer. And there you go. All right, so it's been 2 weeks since I filmed the video, and I've been able to run the car a few times. I've bashed it, I've taken it to the carpet track and ran it. And what I did now to kind of show you is I took the shock off, and you know, the suspension has loosened up, the hinge pin has loosened up, and it moves fairly freely now. So I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue having those hinge pins really tight when you install them. Just a disclaimer, I did not buy the Hot Racing transmission case. I bought an Amazon special, so I'll link that down below. You know, the Hot Racing is probably going to have better tolerances and machining so that the fitment is going to be better. But if you know what you're doing and you can, you know, do some of the modifications that I had to do, like drill out the spacer. I actually had to add an extra shim onto the top shaft to eliminate some play, and it's solid. I've never seen a slash with, you know, such a solid top shaft. You can see here, I mean, there's no play in it whatsoever, and it spins very smoothly. So very happy overall with the installation. Yeah, I had some issues, but overall I think it's a great product. I think you know, this is a good budget way to upgrade your transmission, and you can do it in steps. So you can get the transmission case, you know, first, or any of them in any order really, but you know, instead of paying, you know, $100 or something like that all at once, you can upgrade in stages and take care of this budget build. And you know, it's been great so far. I haven't had any issues. I'll put a link down below of the Hot Racing transmission case as well as some Amazon specials, so you can check it out. So please leave any comments down below if you found this helpful, or if you have any tips for other fellow RCers. Please like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks.